Hello, I'm Dan Gibson, and this is another video, a question and answer video this time. One of our viewers, Khalifa, has asked a question. The question is, when Ibn Zubair moved the Kaaba to today's Mecca, was it a planned move? If yes, how did he zero in on the present location in Mecca? Any clues to that? Thank you, Khalifa. It's a good question, and we need to clarify a couple of things as we answer. In 70 after the Hijrah, Ibn Zubair was in the middle of a civil war. I think he realized it was going to drag on for a long time, so the idea came to move the Black Stone away from the city to safekeeping. There's no indication that he was planning to create a new Kaaba or a new Qibla direction. I think that came later. From my reading of the text, there were a large group of horses and camels available in the city. They were brought by his brother Musab. I also think that it was mostly older men, women, children that were moved away from the war zone in the city. So why Mecca in Saudi Arabia? Now just look at a map. It was far away from Damascus, pretty well as far away as they could get without actually going down into Yemen. They would not want a populated area because the local people might end up claiming the Black Stone for themselves, so they wanted an isolated place. And there was a trade route that was going through this Mecca valley that was occasionally used by merchants who were shifting from the coastal road to the internal incense route. And Mecca is on that connecting route between the two main trade routes. Also, Mecca had an ancient well. The original name of that well has been lost to us, but there was a well there, so there was water in that location. Last, the original tribes in the area were probably more hostile to Damascus than they were to these few people who settled around the ancient well, with their herds of camels. I've not been able to find the original name of that valley, nor of the well that was there. That's been lost to us in history. In time, the war went badly for Ibn Zubair, and eventually he was killed by General Hajjaj, who had been sent down from Damascus. At that point, Hajjaj makes a token effort to repair the Kaaba building, but he has no black stone to put into the corner of the Kaaba. It's interesting to note that there are two instances in history around this time that people took oaths using the term "by the Lord of the corner and the station," rather than swearing by the Lord of the Black Stone. That indicates to me that the Black Stone was missing from the Kaaba building. It's just an idea. I have no absolute proof. Now, Khalifa asks a second question. Since Mecca of today, it's still in a very inhospitable location. How did they get so many people to move there, and where did they manage to procure water, food, etc.? It would not have been easy to get people to move from a big city like Petra to the desolate place like Mecca. That's the question. Again, it's a very good question, but there is an assumption in it. How did he get so many people to move? The issue here is how many people made the initial move and how many people came later and drifted down there over the years. As far as the initial move, it could have been quite a small number of people. Remember, their assignment was to take the Black Stone, which was not a huge stone. It could have been carried by a single camel. And they were to take it far away from the armies of Damascus and hide it in the desert. It would seem that women and children came along and accompanied them, but there's no proof of that. So it could have been a small number of people, maybe 20 or 30 people, maybe less, we don't know, that made the move down originally. As I mentioned, there was an old well in the center of the valley, and I'm sure there was some grazing for camels and sheep around that well. During my time with the Bedouin, the shepherds would take their flocks of goats and camels out into the barren desert, but they would find things for them to eat. You and I would starve, because we not only need our prepared food, we probably want a Starbucks as well. But some Bedouin live solely off of camels and goats. So, There are some green places in southern Saudi Arabia, so it would have been possible for them to travel to those places and to purchase some foodstuff from those regions. Only 100 kilometers away, there's a valley with some agriculture. That valley was on the main route, the main incense route, so it was not hard for the original guardians of the Black Stone to obtain grain and rice at that place. Now, if you go south from Mecca, down Wadi Numan, and then cross over a mountain range, you come into Al-Hada. That's the area I'm talking about. There was agriculture in Al-Hada. Today, there's a highway that joins these two, and so it only takes about an hour's drive to go from one to the other. Then from Al-Hada, you can cross over the next mountain range, and you come to a very fertile place. So these purchases could have been made. They could have gone there and bought supplies. So that brings us to another interesting question. I'm sure they took some money with them when they fled from the armies of Damascus, but how did they earn more money when they got there? They may have had enough money for months, maybe even a year, maybe even 2 years. We don't know how much money they took with them, but eventually they needed a source of income. Now, you can imagine all of the gossip that took place in the surrounding areas around Mecca. The famous black rock that was, it's in a valley just over there. You can imagine that people came to see it, and they would, some would come and they would want to worship it, especially the pagans. Muslims would have come to touch it and to kiss it and to revere it. So from the very earliest time, right from when the rock was moved, I think people would start making journeys to Mecca, just the surrounding people, to the Black Stone. And so the local people in Mecca there with the stone, they'd have to provide food for them and housing for them, feeding them. And so people would come and need to buy what they needed. So commerce would have started quite soon after. Now, 8 years after the Black Stone was moved, the Kaaba building was built, and the area around it was called the Masjid al-Haram. Now, how do I know this? How do I know it was 8 years later? There are inscriptions written on the rocks just 60 kilometers from Mecca in the region of Huma al-Namur. These inscriptions have verses of the Quran, supplications asking for forgiveness, mercy, martyrdom, paradise, trust and belief in the Prophet Muhammad, and the sending of prayers and blessings on him. One inscription stands out as it contains the full Shahada, the testimony. It also tells us that that year the Masjid al-Haram was constructed. The inscription is clearly dated as 78 after the Hijrah. So here we have an inscription, only 60 kilometers away, made by the people that lived in the area and saying Masjid al-Haram was built this year over there. So that was the year they decided to build Masjid al-Haram around the Black Rock. The date is written in stone. Masjid al-Haram was not built hundreds of years or 1,000 years before in Mecca. The date is written there. In the year 89, now about 10 years later, it was reported that the well of Zamzam was lost, most likely from a flood or something that swept through the center of Petra. So with the original Zamzam covered over with rubble in far-off Petra, it wouldn't be hard to name the local well in Saudi Arabia as Zamzam. Then a couple of years after this, in 94 after the Hijrah, more of the city of Petra was destroyed in an earthquake. It was about then that the focus of many people turned towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So to answer Khalifa's question, I think only a small group of people went to Mecca. The original intent seemed to be keeping the Black Stone away from the Umayyads. Over the next 20 years, however, Mecca was developed and it became a center of pilgrimage. People started going there, and so the local people in Mecca were earning income from those who were coming. Eventually, all of the history associated with the first Kaaba in Mecca, that was one over in Petra, that first Kaaba, all of that history was associated with the Kaaba in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And later historians just spoke about one Mecca, and both histories merged as one in their minds. Those who held to the first Qibla were known as the traditionalists. Those who accepted the new Qiblas were known as reformers. Eventually, the reformers won out, and the original Kaaba building was totally forgotten. I hope this answers your question, Khalifa. Thank you for sending it in. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another question and answer video.